economics portion. This is cumulative impacts, resilience, and adaptation. So in terms of the white paper, this is kind of a catch-all part of the paper. All important topics that the section authors wanted to include, but they're a little bit diverse, shall we say. And we have 4 great panelists to talk us through this. We have Carrie Pomeroy from University of California, Santa Cruz. We have Tim Novotny from the Oregon Dungeness Crab Commission, Ron Smolowitz from the Fishery Survival Fund, and Teresa Johnson from University of Maine. So I will not take up any more time, and I will hand it over to Carrie. I believe she has slides that she will be sharing with us all.
And Carrie, you're on mute.
Apologies, I'm getting there.
No, we can hear you now. It's great.
Yeah. And I need to put myself on that view.
Beautiful.
Okay, but I don't get to use my cheat sheet, which is the presenter view, but that's okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you this afternoon. I've been here all day and part of yesterday, lots of great food for thought. I don't have very much time here, so I'm going to zoom through a few slides. I did want to circle back on some marine space use considerations based on some work we've done in the past and have ongoing now related to offshore renewable energy development, but also coordination with ocean aquaculture development off the coast of California. Without further ado, let me jump in there, and I'm happy to circle back on particular details a little bit later on for anything that I have to pass over very quickly. Oops, let's see, hang on a sec. There we go. The ocean's a busy place. This is sort of one of those things like what we know, right? But we sometimes forget how busy it actually is. And offshore wind development is sort of one of the new players, relatively speaking, in the ocean environment amid all of these other activities that have their own complexities and diversities, linkages to coastside and inland and so on, and interactions on the water and back on land. When we zero in on considerations related to offshore wind siting and the existence of fisheries on the surface, if you will, we can see that they actually have a lot in common. And this is just a sampling of some of the things that are potentially important, really, to each of these different sets of interests. But as we get a little further below the surface, and even on the surface of it, there are some fundamental differences. We can think about different types of marine space use being relatively stationary to relatively mobile, and we run the spectrum, and I gloss over a whole bunch of detail here because there's not the time, but we start to think about how different fisheries operate. For example, they very much operate in 3-dimensional space, or as my kid once said, 3D dimensional space. There are a lot of things going on the water shoreside that influence the way these operations work, what people do, when, where, and how, and so on. And I also want to take a moment here to draw attention to the fact that these are not just boats and gear types operating. These are people. And when we think about the human dimensions of fisheries from a social science perspective, a community perspective, there are people are participating in typically in combinations of fisheries. So and those fisheries may take place over different times of the year, different times of day or night, using various gear types and so on. So when we zero in on one particular type of fishery, we have to remember that's just the tip of the iceberg for an individual and that individual's connected communities, whether communities of interest in terms of the fishing community, commercial, recreational, subsistence, et cetera, coastal communities, communities of place, and so on. And in fact, going into a little bit more of sort of unpacking the differences and some key considerations as we think about this topic, when fishing folks and offshore wind folks think about marine space use and act out marine space use, if you will, there are some fundamental differences in the way they view things, what they count on, and what they need to be able to operate according to. And for example, we would see that fishing tends to be quite dynamic in space and time, whereas in the establishment of an offshore energy or other more fixed facility, it tends to be you get it up and running, which is not trivial, but you get it up and running and you go from there, and you count on that consistency of operation. Whereas fishing folks count on flexibility. We've been hearing a bit about footprint of offshore wind facilities and so on. We need to think more about the footprint of fisheries in the sense of not just where you're catching the fish, but what it takes for you in that three-dimensional space to be able to operate in your fishery, and a number of other things along those lines. So I wanted to call attention to these differences of perspective. These aren't hard and fast. There's variability within and across these, and certainly open for discussion. Be really interested to hear from folks a little bit more on this as we move along. Oops, I keep trying to advance it the wrong way. There we go. I do want to touch briefly also on the idea of data. I think there's a pretty strong interest in and arguably quite a fixation on what data are out there. What can the data tell us? Where are the data? We need the data in order to inform these decisions and evaluate X, Y, and Z. And I think the availability of data to us, for example, fish ticket data, and space use data, for example, AIS for vessels that actually operate under AIS, et cetera, that all has its value and its place. But we need to think very carefully about, well, where are those data coming from in the first place, and how usable are they for purposes of having a conversation about siting, about conduct, about mitigation, et cetera, in the context of something like offshore wind development. What was the purpose of data collection? What's included or excluded? What is the spatial and temporal coverage of those data? And frankly, what's the quality of those data? We know that some data sets are more robust than others, but also if we make certain assumptions about what they represent and don't represent, and those assumptions are incorrect, that could lead us into a whole boatload of trouble. Did it again. There we go. And so one way to start to get at this is to think about things that we've been talking about actually over the past couple of days. The whole idea of ensuring that there's meaningful, transparent, and collaborative design, triangulation of different sources of information, and ground truthing, going back and forth and checking what the data show us, let's say, or a data analysis shows us, and then what's actually happening there on the ground. So I want to go back to something also, I'm nearly wrapping up here. I told you it was going to be a fast one. I wanted to highlight also this concept raised yesterday morning by Dr. Gill, this idea of moving from data poor or data moderate or data rich. He referred to data rich. Arguably, we have a mix of those things depending on where you are and what you're talking about, to information rich. And so typically the question that's asked of fishermen in the context of offshore energy development and in the context of other types of space use introductions such as aquaculture is, where do you fish? And I would suggest that I think what we're hearing, and I think what we know, is we may want to reframe that question and instead ask the question, well, what factors influence where, when, and how fishing actually works? And when I say fishing, I'm talking about everything from getting out on the water to getting back to shore and making sure that the end point of that fishing activity, whether it's the appreciation from the recreation, the enjoyment of home caught seafood, or the marketing of that seafood, thinking about all the different factors that influence that whole process. And further, when conditions change, whether it's establishing an offshore wind facility, or there's climate change, or there are changes in the regulations or the larger economy, what are the impacts and outcomes? And not just on X vessel value, but on all of these other things that we've just been hearing about in the sessions today. And as part of that, we enter into a dialogue with people and we bring to bear lots of different kinds of information about operations and practices and knowledge and values, the norms, the rules that people operate by, the critical relationships and networks among them, and how different things like regulations and environmental conditions affect what they do, how they fare, and how the future looks. So just to wrap up, Chris Oliver mentioned, it's important to understand what we know. And here are a couple of things that I would toss out. And then what do we need to know more about? And I would argue that each of these things here and many more things are things that we really need to get integrated more fully into the conversation about offshore wind. I'm excited to be part of the process of helping to call attention to these different features of the system and the situation, and hopefully put everyone on a better footing for finding a way forward. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Carrie.
Okay, next up we have Tim Novotny.
All right, thank you very much. Are you hearing me okay?
We can, thank you.
All right, I want to say what a great job Carrie did, and covered a lot of ground, and I feel a little bit like Tiny Tim coming on after the Beatles. That was a hard act to follow right there. Younger members of the audience will have to Google what I just referenced. I more or less have a statement that I'm going to try to drive home a point that I want to have everybody kind of take with them from the day and from the symposium going forward. And that is along the lines of what Carrie was saying, which is to get people to maintain that open line of communication constantly, and keep that going, to try to get information going back and forth of what wind energy folks are looking for, what they're gathering data-wise, and finding out what's important for the fishing industries, not just the ones that are impacted by the particular site. Because as I'll mention, impact to one fishery, I think in any area, but what we know out here is an impact to one fishery is an impact to all. So again, the primary point I want to make today is that this isn't something that happens in a vacuum. I represent the Oregon Dungeness Crab Commission, which is a part of the Oregon Dungeness crab fishery, just one of several off our Oregon coast. Many fishermen are involved in other fisheries, not just the crab fishery. They fish whiting, they fish tuna, they fish shrimp. It can have a domino effect if they have a disruption in whiting that can domino through other fisheries. It can domino into the coastal economies, as Carrie kind of alluded to. There is impacts down the road. To give you an idea of what in particular our industry faces, crabbers have a variety of uncertainties under the most normal of circumstances, typical risks such as weather, just getting in and out of our bars safely, especially bars that have needed repair for a number of years, if not decades, safety's sake. Price negotiations on an annual basis to determine whether or not we get out on time. It's a seasonal thing. We are running against the clock in a derby fishery. Some of the fishermen have to get on to the next fishing industry for them to make their business plan. We are also facing changing ocean conditions and rising threats of ocean acidification, hypoxia. We don't know how ultimately soon that's going to arrive. We had started to see some impacts to juvenile crab already, which we had figured was maybe more like 10 years off, that has already started to show up. The persistent concern over the domoic acid challenge that can impact crab. It's brought on by microscopic algae that can cause health problems when levels are too high. That sometimes it requires constant testing, and sometimes will close our fishery. Sometimes it will, in recent years, we've allowed for evisceration where we can continue to crab, but we can't sell live crab. We can only sell processed crab. That impacts what the processors do. It impacts the price of the crab. Then there's the shift in the movement of whales lately. Some may think that's related to water and the warmth of the water, but we're trying to figure that out, why the whales are moving, where they're moving, because we've had issues, California more notably than Oregon or Washington, but there is concerns of that. rising entanglement issue. Of course, our folks in the Northeast are dealing with that problem as well. That's prompted in Oregon new efforts to try to impose regulations to mitigate that risk so that they don't have them imposed from outside the industry. There's the recent potential challenge raised due to the efforts recently to introduce and reestablish predators like the sea otter, which on the one hand might help in terms of bringing back eelgrass and kelp, but they're voracious eaters of our product and could run amok because of their inability to be limited due to federal regulations and federal protection laws right now. So it's a very dicey project in that aspect that we're keeping our eye on and trying to work with that potential effort and keeping our eyes on what's going on there. And last but certainly not least, there are uncertain and unexpected challenges like this global pandemic, hopefully singular, which can really play havoc on the markets. It shut down our export market last year. It has certainly wreaked havoc on restaurants. We don't know how long or to what extent that will be, but that will impact the market going forward, at least for the short term, if not long term. All of these are interrelated in many ways. And so when something then happens to impact where we get to fishing grounds, if that impacts and causes vessels to hang it up, and that, say, wait, I can't do this fishery or that fishery, and that's going to impact all my business, so it just makes sense to get out of it, then that starts to impact the market from a number of ways, because if you have fewer boats going out, bringing in fewer product, processors don't have enough money to keep their processing floor active as much. They can't pay as many people to be on the floor. Then they can't, process at will. They have to tell people when they can accept product. That goes into pricing. It impacts one thing after another on down the line, but it all comes back to communication and communication being key from the beginning. Now, I know some people are a little farther in the process than on the West Coast, but it has to be communication constant and from the beginning, and it can't be a situation where the cart gets put before the horse. In some cases, unfortunately, that's been the case. And if we can correct it in some way, and I think this is a big step towards it, events like this, to try to get things back on the proper footing, we need to do that, because the fishermen are going to be able to help everybody get a little better understanding of what they're looking for, and to get a better understanding of the needs of the wind energy and the wind floating towers and where they need to be, and can kind of tell them this is where will work best for us. And that's all I have.
Great, Tim, thank you so much.
Thank you. Next up, we have Ron Smolowitz.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. My name's Ron Smolowitz. Way of a background, I've been going offshore doing research since 1972 for fisheries, mostly in the Northeast, but in South America, Hawaii, South Pacific, Alaska, the West Coast. So I have a background. My field was called exploratory fishing and gear research. Nowadays, it's called surveying and conservation engineering. The aspect I want to talk about is fisheries development. I doubt that existing science can predict what's going to happen in the future as we develop these wind farms. So we definitely are going to need adaptive management, which is what we really practice in fisheries. We understand that we have very little knowledge of how systems work out there, as much as we take pride in that we know something. And one of the key things we have to make sure we develop is the funding sources for fisheries development. Now, currently, the research that I've seen funded is to support government's role to monitor the wind developers and to help develop as Walter Cruikshank said, the EIS statements, the DSEIS statements, the EAs. they're not helping fishing. The grant money I've seen coming out of Mass CEC or NYSERDA, again, they don't help the fishing industry. What really, the help we need, as mentioned, been mentioned a number of times, is the survey technologies and the monitoring to assess the marine living resources throughout their range. Just doing a gillnet study inside and outside of a wind energy area does not provide any data that helps commercial fishing. What we need is resource-wide stock assessments. And the agency that could do that is the National Marine Fisheries Service. That's where their expertise is. And as a community, wind developers, fishing, science, we should make sure that the agency gets enough funding to do their job. Or else we're not going to move forward at all. So survey technologies and monitoring the resource are key. I want to point out two examples of issues that I see may occur. Like I said, we can't predict, but how science may address those issues. So one, in Southern New England now, almost 1 million acres are planned to be developed into this wind energy area that stretches. It's an insonified fence 100 miles long. We have a lot of species that migrate through this area from offshore into inshore environments. And we have a lot of fisheries, primarily recreational, that depend on these resources. Black sea bass now, summer flounder, bluefish, you name them. Well, we heard in the first day of this meeting that these wind turbine platforms may, and the habitat that's being constructed around them may in fact become attractive for these species. So what we might see is an abundance of these species within the wind areas, but they'll be totally depleted near shore. And I mean, Massachusetts has spent a lot of money building dockside fishing piers for the communities to actually be able to fish off the shore. The people that can't afford charter vessels or expensive fishing vessels to go 20, 25 miles offshore. So there's going to be a social justice issue that I think is going to be fun to watch. The other issue that I heard that I thought was entertaining is the seals. Now, seals, if in fact they become associated with the wind energy areas because they feed, whether they feed on the barnacles and mussels on the platforms, or they feed on the black sea bass or winter flounder that are feeding on those, these areas could increase the abundance of seals and spread their range. And before you know it, we'll have seals hauling out on the beaches of Martha's Vineyard, Block Island, and Long Island, interfering with the beachgoers. And then, of course, the white sharks that follow the seals will further put a nail into the coffin of a multi-billion-dollar tourism industry and recreational industry. We'll see how that works out. In the meantime, I work for the scallop industry. That's who I watch out for. And we know that climate change, independent of whether the wind farms are going up or not, and personally, I don't think they'll ever allow us to fish within these wind farms. But we need to make sure we have a very dynamic and growing scallop industry that provides a stable resource. Right now, we produce about $500 million of product a year at the dock. And one of the things we know is we have climate change potentially impacting us. And we need to develop methods to increase production. And it might be active management strategies like predator control, which has been anathema to fisheries management, transplanting scallops, the same for clams, developing mussel fisheries, and developing new fisheries offshore away from the shelf. That's where I see the applied science or engineering needs to be done to provide alternative strategies for the fishing industries that may or may not be displaced by these wind farms. But we can't wait 10, 20 years to have science prove a problem and then go try to find ways to have the fisheries economically survive. And I just remember back when I first started in 1972, the issue was all steel lobster traps could go on fishing forever. So I, with others, developed a plastic lobster trap escape vent, dealt with the issue. And lately we had turtles interacting with the scallop fishery. we developed the turtle deflector dredge. Whatever the problem is, we address that issue as it pops up. So we have to be adaptive and we have to have the funding to respond to it. Thank you.
Ron, thank you.
Thank you. And next up, we have Teresa Johnson, who I believe has her own slides.
As Teresa loads up, I know people are anxious for a break and we want to make sure Teresa gets her good words in. So I think we're probably going to have very limited to no questions before break, but please use the chat function, which Maggie can open fully, and or the Mentimeter, just so we can get questions or points in on these topics, which are super important as we have this discussion. So Teresa, over to you.
Great, thank you. I think you can see my slides all right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yep, you can.
Okay, great. Thank you for inviting me to participate. I really enjoyed the conversations today. Given the time, I'm going to be quick and simple. I've been asked to talk about the concept of social license to operate. And I'm going to echo a lot of what's already been said today. So that's kind of nice, I think. But just quickly, my remarks are going to keep it a very broad level. My remarks are based on some social science research that my colleagues and I have conducted on tidal power development, wind power, as well as other uses of the marine environment like aquaculture. So the concept of social license to operate has been around for about 30 years, yet it remains somewhat ambiguous and is still evolving. It was first used in the context of mining, but it's since been applied to other sectors, including aquaculture, wind energy, and others. Social license to operate refers to community acceptance of or approval of a company in its operations. It should be viewed as dynamic. It has an important process dimension, and I'll talk about that. It requires time and effort to obtain and can be lost if stakeholder preferences and experiences change. Okay, so it's important because as you know, as we've been talking and as you all know, that social or public acceptance is a critical factor constraining the development of renewable energy. So key questions related to this are, under what conditions are communities more likely to grant a social license to operate? What is needed to maintain it? And should this idea of a social license to operate be part of the decision-making process? And if so, how? Previous research, and again, this has been mentioned already, indicates that social acceptance is influenced by procedural justice, distributional justice, and trust. And I think these are some questions that we should think about in terms of a social science research program around this area of social license to operate. So procedural justice refers to this idea of, do stakeholders view the decision-making process as fair, or the research process as fair? Distributional justice, the costs and benefits being shared, are the impacts and benefits distributed fairly? And this idea of trust, does the community trust the information and the intention of the actors, including the developers, but also the decision makers and the scientists? So I just quickly, I'm not going to go into details, but these three dimensions emerged as part of the work that I did as part of the Maine Tidal Power Initiative, which was a collaborative effort to inform the development of tidal power in Maine, to sort of think about the different dimensions of tidal power development. We developed a transdisciplinary framework that I think is helpful in thinking about these collaborative efforts and endeavors that need to be done. We've been talking about how to engage fishermen and others today. Our framework emphasizes the importance of engaging multiple disciplines, and we had our team included oceanographers, biologists, engineers, and social scientists, but also a diverse set of stakeholder groups. And we talked about there's a lot of different interests going on that we need to think about. This includes policy, regulators, community members, the industry, as well as, of course, the fishing industry. And I led the social science team, and we studied the perceptions of impact and social acceptance, as well as collaboration, engagement. How did community members and different stakeholders want to be involved in the process? And we found, not surprisingly, that stakeholders wanted to be engaged in the conversation earlier than later, right? And it's also really important to build up, trust, and transparency proved to be really important. So social license to operate is similar to the concept of social carrying capacity, which my colleagues and I have studied in the context of aquaculture development in Maine. It refers to the amount of development that a community is willing to allow. And like social license to operate, it looks at, is interested in understanding drivers of social acceptance as well as conflicts. And these are assessed through surveys, interviews, focus groups, things like that. Some of the things that my colleagues and I found to be important through this various research that I talked about. Again, these are things that we've already heard about today. The process is very important. Having transparency that comes across as particularly important. One that allows information sharing across groups, allows stakeholders to have opportunities to have a say in the process, things like that. Again, we've heard a lot of this today. Being engaged in the research, having an opportunity there. The speed and scale of development is important. And this is where cumulative impacts, I think, become very important. Relationships among the developers and the community, among stakeholders and decision makers and scientists. I mean, we talked a lot about this, which is obviously these things are important. The role of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and especially Sea Grant Cooperative Extension have important roles to play, particularly when serving as neutral parties. They can help facilitate conversations and knowledge exchange in this arena. So I'm going to quickly leave you with a quote from a tidal power development in Maine that I think kind of sums up this importance of this idea of social license to operate or community acceptance. And it's the idea that, you can have the best technology and intentions, but a company still or a project still needs to have community support if it's going to be successful. We need to think about how do we proceed in a way that, does that the best, way that we can. So thank you. And I think we'll not take questions now, or is that what you said?
Thank you so much, Fiona. I think because of time and the time of day, I wonder if it makes sense to make sure people, we'll leave the chat open during break. If people want to enter questions, the Mentimeter as well, and maybe just go quickly to breakout instructions and take a break. Fiona, is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.